Well, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, from wherever you're joining us across this great country. My name is Kathy Pete, and I want to thank all of you for joining us for this important conversation that will explore the connection between synodality and Indigenous truth and reconciliation. Concerned Lay Catholics is very grateful to our panelists and Elder Bernice and Rosalma for being with us tonight and for helping to bring this event together as we approach September 30th and the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. I'd like to introduce Elder Bernice, and she will begin with an opening prayer, invocation, and the land acknowledgement.
Hello, everybody. I will start with giving thanks to Mother Earth. Mother Earth, your children send you greetings, thanksgiving, and love. To the plant life, food, medicines, and trees, your human relatives send you greetings, thanksgiving, and love for our nourishment. Waters of the world, your human relatives send you love for the cleansing of our thirst. Grandfather Thunders, we thank you for renewing the rivers and lakes and also for cleansing the thirst of our gardens. Grandmother Moon, we thank you for the birth of our children. Oh, brother sun, we thank you for the light and warmth. My creator, I thank you for the privilege of living on Mother Earth. Oh, great spirit, creator God, we thank you, Yahweh, for your kindness in bringing us all together today. Though we may not know what this meeting holds, we know that you do. As we begin, help us, creator, to keep your word in mind. Lead us to conversations that are fruitful and enrich the lives of those who are here today. When we are undecided, please lead us in your wisdom. When our opinions may disagree, help us to remain respectful to one another. More than anything, Creator, would you help us both to see your will and to pursue your glory through all that we say and do. Let us be one mind and be thankful. I'm also giving thanks to the plants, sacred plants, sweetgrass, cedar, sage, and tobacco, our medicines which grow on Mother Earth. Cleanse and protect the people in this meeting from negative energy so that they may have a good session in peace and harmony. I thank you for your purification and healing you provide in the sacred plants. I will now do the land acknowledgement. As we gather today in fellowship, let us take a moment to honor and recognize the Indigenous peoples who have stewarded this land for generations. We acknowledge that we are meeting on the traditional territories of those who have cared for the earth long before us, and we express our respect for their wisdom, resilience, and enduring relationship with creation. As Catholics, we are called to walk humbly and work for justice. We commit ourselves to listen, learn, and stand in solidarity with Indigenous communities, seeking reconciliation and healing through prayer, conversation, and action. May our time together be guided by respect, compassion, and a spirit of unity. Let us hold in our hearts the hope for peace and equity, and remember that our actions today shape the legacy we leave for generations to come.
Thank you, Bernice, for that beautiful prayer and land acknowledgement. I'd like to now introduce our moderator for this evening. Rosalma has been a joy to work with, and we have spent a lot of hours putting this together. So I want to thank Rosalma so much for her incredible leadership in this event. Dr. Rosalma McDonald is respected and well known through her work with the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops on important issues such as human trafficking in Indigenous populations, and as a contributing author to the National USCCB Native American Pastoral Plan. Dr. McDonald comes from a strong Catholic background founded on Native ministry and faith formation. Dr. McDonald was recently featured in a Cardis publication on Indigenous Voices of Faith. Cardis is a nonpartisan think tank dedicated to clarifying and strengthening through the research and dialogue the ways in which society's institutions can work together for the common good. Through her work, Dr. MacDonald has represented over 633 First Nations on national policy issues related to health, social development, disability, and injury prevention, in addition to over 500 tribal and disadvantaged populations and jurisdictions in the USA. I'll turn it over to Rosalma, in whose capable hands we will spend the next almost 2 hours engaging in this wonderful conversation. So Rosalma, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kathy. I'm so excited about this because it came out of a conversation, a journey of encounter in Waterloo. So here we are, and I'm very excited. I want to say, Sago, good evening, and welcome to everyone. I can see some of you on the top of the screen here. So first, I would like to acknowledge the traditional unceded territory where the virtual gathering is taking place. We acknowledge that many of the lands we live, work, and meet on are the traditional territories of Indigenous peoples across this country. Thank you, Yawankoa Bernice, for your opening prayer and land acknowledgement. Yawankoa. So as Kathy mentioned, my name is Rosalma McDonald, but a lot of people fondly know me as Dolly. So you you can call me Dolly. And I also have a Mohawk name, Godinez. So I'm a Mohawk from the Akwesasne First Nation located near Cornwall, Ontario. And I'm pleased to welcome you to the Concerned Lay Catholics virtual conversation on how can synodality further the cause of Indigenous truth and reconciliation in the Catholic Church of Canada. On behalf of the Concerned Lay Catholics, I would like to thank you for joining us for this very important conversation. I would especially like to thank Kathy, for following up on this conversation and organizing this webinar. The concept of Indigenous synodality. Concerned Lay Catholic is an independent group that endeavors through various programs and activities to help lay Catholics find their own voice and bring it forth in order to live out the laity's role of co-responsibility in our church. The idea for this webinar came from the Journey of Encounter, as I mentioned, that was held in June in Waterloo, Ontario, during a panel session that featured Bishop of Valleyfield, Alain Faubert. The idea of an Indigenous synod was proposed. The Indigenous participants of the Journey of Encounter were very favorable to the idea, which resulted in this follow-up conversation on the idea of an Indigenous synod. The purpose of this virtual conversation is to engage with our distinguished panel and to discuss how can synodality further the cause of Indigenous truth and reconciliation in the Catholic Church. This is an opportunity to explore the basis of synodality, where people really hear each other and to come to understand one another's experience. This process is about transformation of relationships that can be possible. We are excited to have you join us as we approach the September 30th National Day for Truth and Reconciliation in Canada. You are invited to listen to our distinguished panel of leaders from various Indigenous communities to reflect on the implications of synodality of truth and reconciliation in the Canadian context. We will be talking about what can Indigenous Catholics teach us about synodality, how might adopting a spirit of synodality open the church to greater inclusion of Indigenous voices, and what role can each of us play, Indigenous, non-Indigenous, lay, clergy, religious, in this transformation. So now I'm very pleased to introduce our distinguished panel. We'll start with Honorable Graydon Nicholas. Order of New Brunswick, was the 30th Lieutenant Governor of New Brunswick from 2009 to 2014, becoming the first Indigenous person to hold this office. He was born on the Tobique Reserve in 1946 and is a member of Wasatch Nation, and he was appointed as a provincial court judge from 1991 to 2009. He worked with the Union of New Brunswick Indians as legal counsel, chairman of the board, and president of the Union of New Brunswick Indians from 1974 to 1988. Graydon joined the Knights of Columbus in 2009. He was elected as a Supreme Director in Philadelphia in 2015 for a 3-year term. He was also appointed to the Endowed Chair of Native Studies in 2015 at St. Thomas University. He is involved with teaching, research, and community interaction. He is a recipient of the Order of Canada in May 2016, and he was appointed to the Guadalupe Circle of the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops in December 2016 to represent the Knights of Columbus. Recently, he was installed as the Chancellor of St. Thomas University in May 2021 for a year of for a term of 4 years. Welcome, Graydon. He's my friend. Father Daryl Winkler is a priest in the Archdiocese of Ottawa, Cornwall, serving as the pastor of St. Basil's Church in Ottawa. Born in Chicago, Illinois, he hails from a diverse heritage with an Indigenous mom and an American father. He is a proud member of the Machiking First Nation. Father Daryl is one of only 7 Indigenous priests in Canada, making his role significant in the broader context of the church's engagement with Indigenous communities. Father Winkler's commitment to his faith and his cultural roots is a central aspect of his identity. His enthusiasm for the Synod on synodality and reflects his deep belief in the importance of dialogue, inclusivity, and listening within the church. Welcome, Father. And Brother Thomas Novak is a member of the Missionary Oblates of Mary Immaculate. He has mission among the Cree and Métis nations who taught him the Cree language. For many years, he worked in social justice for the Oblates. He chaired the Manitoba Aboriginal Rights Coalition at a time when the coalition organized public inquiry into the effects of hydro flooding on northern Indigenous communities. He is currently employed by the Archdiocese of Winnipeg to organize sessions for education around Indigenous issues and dialogue between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. He is also an outreach worker for St. Godly Indigenous Catholic Parish. Welcome, Brother everyone. So we're going to jump right into it. Just for the benefit of our audience, we'll be I'll be asking 4 questions of the panel members, and they'll answer me individually. And after we do the 4 questions, then we'll have a Q&A, and then we'll have a wrap-up dialogue after and a closing prayer by our elder. So the first question is, in the synodal process in Canada, how well do you think Indigenous voices were reflected? Please feel free to draw on your own experience as well as the National Synthesis Report of the CCCB. And we'll start with Father Daryl.
Okay. So, when the when we first started hearing about the synodal process back in 2021, many people didn't know what it meant, but I jumped on board right away. I seemed to be a fish in water when Pope Francis was talking about the importance of listening and how listening can transform not just ourselves, but the whole world. If we developed a way to listen to one another, this is the real effort and the point of synodality is listening. So I was pastor. I'm no longer pastor at St. Basil's. My appointment ended at the end of July, but I'm been granted a sabbatical to study reconciliation across Canada. So I'm imbued. I'm just, the Pentecostals say we need to soak in the scriptures, just bathe and soak in the scriptures. And that's what I'm doing right now with reconciliation. I'm books and articles and talking about and planning where I'm going. Nevertheless, okay. So synodality, I was very keen on right away. Fortunately, in the parish that I was pastor, they were also very keen on it. And we were able to do all kinds of listening sessions. almost 22 listening sessions in our parish. 2 of them involved Indigenous listening sessions. One was just for Indigenous people, and the second was like allies, people who are interested in Indigenous things, Indigenous themes, reconciliation, and all. And so we had sessions for women, different sessions on women. We had a session just for disaffected Catholics, those who just kind of gave up on the church for many, many different reasons. We had sessions for the LGBT community. We had sessions for single mothers, single parents, because they feel a stigma in our church today. So many people in our parish were interested in being able to talk about their experience in the church today. And so were the Indigenous people. So, and we had youth. There was a whole listening session just for our young people. They didn't do, they're bored by sharing circles. Youth are. They don't, it's not their thing. They would rather draw pictures and draw, images, and that's what we did for them. So now the question is, how was the voice heard? Well, in our parish, yes. We had a significant listening of Indigenous peoples in the Archdiocese of Ottawa and through our parish. But if you read the document, the synthesis that came out from Canada in 2022, within the 3rd paragraph, they're talking about reconciliation. So it's an important theme for Canada. The Canadian Church, that is one of the primary themes that we need to discuss, reflect upon, act upon, and do. So that and many other, there are several topics that are very important in the church's agenda, can I say, but one of them is reconciliation. And I think that at least, I was very thrilled to read that there was an acknowledgement of the need for reconciliation. And we'll see how things develop and develop and grow. So that's what I don't know. That's what I would say. I think there was representation of Indigenous voice. I don't know how many Indigenous voices participated in the synodal process in phase 1, but at least people were thinking about it. We were touching upon, that's my experience. It's limited and it's just in my own context, but that's what I experienced. Miigwech.
Thank you, Father Darrell. Graydon, what do you think?
What do I think? Well, first of all, I never went to any particular meetings. I'm not even sure how active it was in our diocese, but I've been involved with the bishops now since about 1998 on different Indigenous issues across this country. So I was when I did read the synopsis that the bishops in fact did write, and I'm glad I read it to get some ideas of what areas covered. I think Darrell's already indicated about the importance of reconciliation. I think what shocked our church was the discovery of unmarked graves in Kamloops, and I think that woke up the church completely of how could children have died under the care of not just the Catholic Church, but the other Christian churches as well. And how come so many children died under the care? There now it's maybe up to 5,000 children who died and never went home. So all those things I think shocked our Catholic brothers and sisters that I know of, and they just could not understand how this happened. So I think this emphasis on healing, emphasis on reconciliation, I think that's a theme that's going to go on forever. I mean, when we stop and think of what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission with the 94 calls to action, all those very, very, I'd say probably only about 20% have been discussed and implemented, not just within our church, but within general public. And I've talked to many different faith denominations, and they just can't. How did this happen? Why did this happen? So I think within our Catholic faith, this is still another stage of the colonial experience that our people would have had since Christopher Columbus made the navigational error and landed not in India, but in an island in the Caribbean. And I say that in a way in jest, because how can you discover people who were already here? How can you claim lands that are ours, our ancestral lands? And the beautiful prayer that Bernice read to all of us, to there were thousands and thousands and thousands of generations of people ahead of us. But this is what concerns me, I guess, about the report that was there, and the role that we're being asked to toward the next steps, I guess. So I'll stop there. Dolly or Rosalma, as I know her, but yeah, but I think I wasn't there. I was too busy with other things, but I welcome the opportunity to share my views tonight.
Thank you, Graydon. Thomas, your
You're
microphone
muted,
isn't,
Thomas.
your microphone, turn your microphone
you.
on. There.
First of all, I'll say that I don't have a cold. I'm not sick. I only have one working vocal cord. So that's why I talk a little rough. I've read a couple of times now the document that came from the CCCB, the compilation of everything that was said across the 10 provinces and 3 territories. I was pleased with the words. Almost as Daryl said, almost every page, there's something about Indigenous people and reconciliation is very positive. But I remember that the word synodal is not a word it's a verb. It's not just a word, it's a verb. It's about action. And I think we only become synodal when we respect the words on the page and start living what we are committing ourselves to or what we're talking about. And just as we had this week in our church at St. Catherine, and I see Peter Bisson is with us, he was there. But to me, this was an example of a synodal prophetic action. We were celebrating Truth and Reconciliation Month, and we're honoring our survivors and welcoming our new bishop who was there at our parish for the first time. We're lucky because he'd spent most of his life with Indigenous people. When we welcomed the bishop, one of our elders welcomed him formally, and he sang an honor song with his drum, and then he took his eagle fan and brushed him down every part of his body. That took a little while. And then we honored our survivors. We gave them all a medicine bundle and honored them with an honor song. And then our elder gave the bishop his eagle fan, and he asked him to brush down, to bless and cleanse and heal all the survivors who were present there. And he just did what he was told. In other words, he wasn't warned this would happen. The elder said, "This is what you need to do now, Bishop," and he did it. For the first hour and a half of our 2.5-hour ceremonies together, the bishop and the priest present sat in silence, quietly. And it was presided, the ceremonies up to that point, the first 2/3, by 2 women. And after we honored the bishop and the survivors, they smoked their pipes and spoke, each gave a teaching. And then we had some more healing and we moved into the liturgy. To me, that was a wonderful prophetic action of what, it's not the total of reconciliation because of, as I say, it's action and it has to move beyond liturgy and the church, but where the leaders, the ones we call the leaders in the church, closed their mouths and opened their ears, listened and responded generously. Écoutez.
Thank you.
Relations.
I think I'm going to put my own little personal opinion in here too. I think synodality and empathetic church is a church that has more Father Daryls. I think that across the country, we need to see more Indigenous people within the clergy, and then as lay Catholics, like, lay ministers like myself. I think that's another, thing to think about in terms of synodality. So we're ready for the second question. So, okay, so the second question is, it has been said that conversations in the spirit methodology is very similar to Indigenous ways of relating and discerning, such as talking circles, healing circles, processes of listening and sharing. In your understanding of synodality, what insights do Indigenous Catholics have to share with the rest of the church about this method? And how might the Canadian church draw on this wisdom to deepen our communion, encourage participation, and strengthen the church's mission? Graydon.
Technically challenged sometime, but I pressed the right button. I guess I'm looking for a key to help me. But well, I think this is probably where I've got a bit more experience on this part. To those who are out there, I mean, I grew up with a Latin mass and memorizing Latin as an altar boy and all that stuff. But changed a lot when I went to university and the Second Vatican Council started to meet and wanted to increase not only the role of the laity, but to make the language of the church in the local community. So I welcomed very much that I could actually, for the very first time, celebrate Mass in English. And so I think that was good. So I understood that a little bit better. But I think we have a perfect example here tonight of how our elder led us in prayer. In her own words, how she said we have to respect all of creation. We have to respect all we have, because in an Indigenous spirituality, everything is gift from our Creator. And so often the people out there, what are you talking about, Creator? You're talking about God the Father, Jesus, or who? But see, there's only one God really for all of us. Okay, God the Father in our Catholic faith, and the Trinity. But actually our people understand all three in our particular spiritualities. And so that probably tonight will be what a lot of people have never heard or shared before. And when we stop and think of what our people have to share, I'll just give you an example. The first baptisms took place in 1610 in Halifax by Grand Chief Membertou, who was the Grand Chief of all the Mi'kmaq Nation. And he and his family and followers became Catholic for two big reasons. Number one, they believed in the Creator, and they believed that Jesus was love. In fact, Jesus was one of us, because one of the things that the missionary says, when did Jesus become Indianized? Well, we all understand when incarnation took place, Jesus was everyone, right? But for Indigenous people, they never fully understood that until they said, when did he become an Indian, one of us? And that was the same theme that Pope John Paul II, he says, Christ in his own body is Indian. So that, for what does that mean? I mean, Jesus is one of us? Of course, for us, anybody who studied theology, yes, it is. And for the priest, it is. But it's important from the pulpit that our people hear that. It's very important. And of course, we have our own prayer, the way we pray, the Our Father, Hail Mary, and glory be, and all that. And those words are more significant in my language than they are in English. I can tell you that. And so we have our own way of praying. But you see, the other thing that the early missionaries did, and I'm sorry, after this, I'll stop. But the missionaries witnessed and realized that Indigenous people have great respect for grandmothers. And so they said, guess what? Jesus has a grandmother too. Her name is Saint Anne. So you can see now how the connection of the Indigenous respect for elders, and in particular of the grandmothers, and how Jesus had a grandmother. You could see that at the very beginning there was this connection between the Mi'kmaq and our own people, the Wolastoqiyik, and the early missionaries. So that has been lost over the span of time, unfortunately, but I think it's coming back now very strong among our own people, certainly for myself. So I'll just stop there, I guess, Rosalma, and allow the other ones also to express their experiences. Thank you.
Thank you, Graydon. Thomas?
As I was reflecting on this question, as I said, synodal is a verb, and I was thinking that for Indigenous people, learning is not very usually with books. It's sitting and listening, but it's also, above all, I think, in my own experience, it's about experiencing. It's an action. Learning is also an action. And it means that for leadership, church people, leaders, bishops, pastoral workers, ordinary Canadians that aren't Indigenous, need somehow to study. Like there's wonderful programs out there like Listening to Indigenous Voices and dialogues that many of us organize, but getting to know Indigenous people, walking with Indigenous people. And I think especially for, I'm going to say something about that, I think later, but for those who work among Indigenous people to experience, to go to ceremonies, to live as close as they can with them, and to be always watching, listening, learning. And one of the things that came to mind was I had a mentor when I was at St. Paul University just before Daryl, Jean-Guy Goulet, who was an oblate, who was an anthropologist among the Dene. And he shared with us how he was hunting with a few Dene men, and they saw a deer and they stopped and they started talking to the deer, and the deer just stood waving his ears like he was listening. And after a while they said, "Thank you," and in their language, and the deer quietly moved off. And Jean-Guy, who was just listening, he said, "Yes, what could you tell me what this was about?" And he said, "Well, the deer was the spirit power of our brother, so we were talking to our brother." And he experienced many interesting realities like that. And the people would say to him, "Well, Father, these are just our superstitions." And then he, being a smart guy and an anthropologist, he started asking people, "Could you tell me in your language what is the word for superstition?" And they gave him a word. They all gave him a word. And then he went and asked other people, "Could you translate this Dene word for me from your language into English?" And they said, "Oh, that means the things that we know." We call superstition are the things that those Dene people knew deep in their souls and their spirits and their bodies. And I think it's important to understand, we that are non-Indigenous, and that's why I really hesitated to be here on this panel, we will never know what Indigenous people know or know like them. So we have to listen very carefully. We have to respect the wisdom that they have that I will never understand because I've never grown up in that culture. And I have to, at least as I live with them, listen to them, experience the ceremonies, then I will start to know a little bit. I'm still a baby. I will know a little bit. And I always try to tell the other priests and pastoral workers I work with, this is what we have to do. We have to be with an experience before we can be a leader in their community.
Excellent. Thank you.
Mhm.
Thank you very much. Father Daryl.
Okay, so a number of years ago, I don't know, 15 years ago, maybe more. I think it's more than that. I'm from Manitoulin Island. My ancestors, my mother's ancestors come from Manitoulin Island, Ojibwe people, Anishinaabe. And I was trying to learn about the church among the native people there when the Jesuits came. And there's a rich collection of letters, Jesuit letters from the 1840s until the 1850s, 60s. And one of these letters, was amazing because they were coming from France, these Jesuits, and they came enthusiastic. They learned the language within 2 years. They were able to speak Ojibwe, and they were communicating with the people, and they came full of zeal and enthusiasm to bring the gospel, that kind of thing. Okay, so 2 of them went to Walpole, what we call today Walpole Island. And the young Jesuit priest, he's about 30 years old. His name was Duranquet, Père Duranquet. And he was with a Jesuit brother whose name was Genesot. And he got this, and he was on Walpole Island, and he saw this beautiful hill covered in trees, and it had a beautiful vista over the lake and the rivers. And so he started chopping down the trees to build a little chapel, a wooden chapel. And the elders came and they were shocked. And they said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "I'm building a little chapel here so that we can pray." And he said, "But this is sacred land. We bury our ancestors here. We bury our dead here. You're building this, doing this here." And he said, "No, I have permission from the Governor General. The Governor General of Canada gave me the permission to build a chapel here." And they said, "Look, we need to have a council." They could have said, "We need to have a synod." And they gathered and they said, "But we're not speaking to you. We only if you have gray hair can you have wisdom." And this was a young guy, 30 years old, this judge. We had no gray hair. So he said, "We need to speak to your elders." So eventually there was a Père Chaunet who came with canoe from Michigan, and he met in a council with these Indigenous elders, and they laid forth the methodology of the conversation they were going to have. And they said, "This is how we're going to do it. We speak first, and we speak until we're finished. And then we pause, and then you speak. And you get to speak until you're finished. And then we pause, and we do several rounds of this until we can have a better understanding of what's going on here. Why is our land being desecrated like this?" And so it was an interesting conversation. And this is a letter by by the Jesuits there describing this council meeting, this methodology of a conversation, of listening, trying to understand where the people were coming from. This was a methodology from the 1840s that the Ojibwe people had, and who knows how long that method of listening. It was part of the method under which the treaties were signed, in a circle, in a sacred environment, listening to one another, sharing, becoming kin with one another. And that's how so when it says here, conversations in the spirit methodology is similar to Indigenous ways, I think that's what Pope Francis had in mind. He said, we have to change people. We have to train people of the Western world how to listen. They don't know how to listen. They love to talk. They'll talk until they're blue in the face. And we see this going on today. They have but they're not speaking with wisdom. So he said, we have to learn how to listen first. That's what the whole point of the synod on synodality has been about, is how do we train people? How do we get them used to a methodology that allows them to hear one another? Because he said, if you want reform in the church, if you want to see transformation in the church, then we can't do it without listening to each other. So I think that Francis was influenced by these methods that Indigenous peoples, and wasn't just in Walpole Island, this was global. This would be ways that Africans and Latin American Indigenous people and Aborigines in Australia, this is how they converse. This was a typical human thing. And I think people of the Western world, their ancestors also had these kinds of ways of communicating. And somehow it got changed, with the rise of colonialism and industrialization and all of these things. We didn't want to listen anymore. We just wanted to talk and tell people how inferior they were. So the question to me is, the methodologies are very essentially similar in that they're trying to teach us what it is to listen with both ears and open minds and open hearts to each other. And Francis said, when you do that, when you listen to someone with this kind of mentality, open mind, so that's why we smudge. That's why Native people smudge, is to have this openness of mind. And when we do that, and the other person, the dialogue partner does it too, we have an encounter. Pope called it a culture of encounter. Encuentro. It means it's richer, and I don't speak Spanish, but he used to talk about encuentro. And when we have an encounter, things are transformed. We're transformed when we really listen to that. Because now I say, oh, that's why you think like that. Now I get it. I'm understanding better the way you're thinking. It's making me a little more sympathetic to what you're having to say. So that's what I think this the conversations in the spirit are attempting. Now they're very rigid. If you've ever seen the methodology, it's very rigid. And it's because it's going to take a long time to teach people of the Western world how to be able to listen. And so we'll start with a rigid pattern, and then eventually it'll become a way of life. And that's what the Synod is trying to teach us, a way of life of listening to one another, so that we can discern God's spirit and what God is where God is leading the church and all society and all of it. So that was a long talk. Anyways, there you have it. Thank you.
That was excellent, all of you. Did anybody want to add anything more onto this particular topic?
I just wanted to say a couple. No, first of all, this is fantastic for my friends here. I'm learning from them as well. But I was thinking, something very practical in this would be like in our parish here in Fredericton, we finally convinced the parish that there should be a land acknowledgement recited before every mass. Now, there was a bit of a difficulty with some of the other people. They said, well, is it part of the Eucharistic celebration or not? So now we do have a land acknowledgement, and it's recited at every Mass and every gathering within our parish. And I think this is, believe me, this is a big fight across Canada. I shouldn't say big fight, big struggle across Canada to have every bishop in Canada have land acknowledgements read before the celebration of liturgy. It's important for our people. It's important for the parishioners to realize that our people here were for thousands and thousands of years. And a lot of people say, well, great, and why do you do that? I said, well, who was responsible for the loss of the land? The church and the government. They're the ones who were in orchestra with the other businesses. So this is almost like a radical thing for people to. But believe me, it's understood and it's needed. It's necessary for our people. I'll just add that on. Sorry about that, Dolly. So.
I want to add on to what Graydon just spoke to. I go to Loblaws to shop just down the street here, the grocery. They have a huge wall that has a land acknowledgement with this beautiful painting, Ojibwe style painting. And all the Loblaws across Canada have a land acknowledgement. And wherever I go, I went to Life Labs to get some blood tests. They have a land acknowledgement on there. When you walk in, there's a land acknowledgement. And at the National Arts Center, when there's a concert, a symphony, or go to listen to Jan Arden or whatever, they start with a land acknowledgement. And I cannot understand why in our diocese, we don't have land acknowledgements. Why is it that we don't acknowledge? I don't know. Now, it seems to be a Catholic, I don't want to be provocative, but the Anglicans do it. All the Anglican churches, they have a land, and the United Church members, they have land. But for some reason, as Graydon says, there's a resistance by bishops and others to have a land acknowledgement. I have no idea where that comes from. Somebody can try to share why. I don't get it myself, because it seems to be denying the role that Indigenous people have in the history of this land. So I don't know, but thank you. Sorry, I don't mean to be provocative, but it's just a question. Like everywhere you turn around, there's land acknowledgements, but in our church, like now there'll be one at the cathedral for the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation here in Ottawa, but it's the only time that there would be a land acknowledgement. It's not a part of the way of doing things. Anyways, thank you.
So should I add to that, Father Darrell?
Well, there's Thomas too. Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Oh, Thomas, did you want to say something else?
Go ahead,
Sorry.
Roseanne, because I'm going to say something a little different.
Well, it goes back to what I was saying earlier about, having Indigenous led. You know, when, like with the cathedral, that mass is Indigenous led, and so it's a given that there's going to be a land acknowledgement. And I think, as a result of synodality, the characteristics of the church need to be felt in the churches, which is kind of what you're saying, Father Daryl. Like like in our parish, it's primarily Mohawk, so you're going to have uh, that influence into the mass, right? And that's a change for the church in some places, and others maybe not yet. Thomas.
At the risk of putting too many words out, but very practically, when I was working, we were having our inquiry into the effects of flooding on First Nations in northern Manitoba. We worked especially with Pimachigamac, Cross Lake First Nation, and they had developed a very interesting model of governance. They kept the band council, which is imposed by the federal government. They kept that, but they had 4 councils. So whenever there was an important decision to be made by the community, they would consult the Women's Council, the Elders Council, and the Youth Council. And I thought that's an interesting model even for our churches. It's not just the ones that are named in leadership, but to make sure that all those whose voices may not be strong and always recognized are brought into the conversation.
Thank you, Thomas. So we have a few comments here that I'm going to share because we have the time. It says here, here in Aylmer, Quebec, land acknowledgement is done only in the month of June, when June is recognized as Indigenous month. And let's see, it just moved on me, sorry. Okay, and then in Regina, at Saint Jean Baptiste, the only French-speaking church in the city, they do have a land acknowledgement every Sunday. And then in St. Joseph Parish in Ottawa, in August, in their welcoming before Mass, they announced their land acknowledgement. It seemed to be a bit abridged for brevity, but it had the impression that it was for every Mass. And then land acknowledgement is every Sunday at Sacred Heart in Edmonton. So I guess we have people from all over the country here. Yay! So those are some good comments, and I guess things are changing. It depends on where you are, and it depends on the readiness, I think, of where you are and the church. So thank you. Any other more things you want to add to that particular topic? Oh, and then we got another comment here. Land acknowledgement at every Mass at St. Basil's in Ottawa. So we must have one of your parishioners, Father Daryl. Okay, I'm going to go to the third question. So, do you see the value in holding an Indigenous synod gathering in Canada? And if so, why? And if not, why? And we'll start with you, Thomas.
Yes.
Okay, yes, there you go.
And just to say a wee bit about that, the Indigenous people, at least here in the West, they love to travel. And it's something that's part of the culture, where people from many nations come together and share. And I hope there would be non-Indigenous people present, and that they would be like our bishop last week, that they would just listen.
Okay. Father Daryl.
I would just say, I would be very, very much in favor of something like an Indigenous synodal gathering, because, a couple of years ago, Graydon was at this. There was an Indigenous leadership gathering. There was about 12. people. There was a couple of native priests. Graydon was there. There were several sisters, Sister Priscilla Solomon. And what I learned from that, this was such a good meeting for me, was basically we all had different approaches. None of us, we weren't all just one lump. We had different interpretations of what reconciliation, the role of Indigenous peoples, what the church meant to us, because basically at the time, and I was very angry with the situation of Indigenous peoples and the bishops and all that. I was an angry person, and I was very upset because for me it became such a visceral issue, but the others weren't. Graydon was not angry. He was not spitting nails at people. Neither was Sister Priscilla Solomon. Neither was Donna Naughton. And the people gathered. Curtis Sapier I think he's also Tobique, same place as Graydon's from. These people were not, they were much different. I was the one that was all, and I recognized and I thought, oh my God, what's wrong with me? They're not all angry either. We have different approaches, we're diverse. We're not all one lump. That's why I think an Indigenous synodal gathering would be so important. We could learn from each other. And as I did from that small gathering we had in Arnprior, the Galilee Center, we had this gathering there. Peter Bisson was there. There was Luke Stocking from the Development and Peace. It wasn't all just natives. There was, supporters there, allies and such. It was such a great experience for me because of the insight that, hey, we're not just all one. Not everybody's angry, like I am. And that was a great learning thing for me. And it changed me. Like there was a transformation that happened in my insights when I listened to these. I was, basically it was a gathering of elders, elder Catholics, Indigenous elders. So, and what benefit would an Indigenous synodal gathering have? I think we'd learn so much and get to meet each other. Like sometimes I feel like we're all alone. I feel like I'm all alone. I have Donna Naughton here in Ottawa with me, and we have some Cree people and Mohawks. There's Dolly and Bernice, very devout practicing Christians. And but sometimes I feel like we're in a silo, and that's not the case. Every urban like Saskatoon, Edmonton, Winnipeg, all of these places have urban Indigenous ministries. I'd like to know more about them. Get to meet these Catholics. What do they like? What can they share? What can I grow? How can I grow in spiritually from dialogue with them? So that's why I think it would be great to have an Indigenous synodal gathering. Yeah, so that's what I would say. Miigwech.
Thank you, Father. Graydon.
I think there's unanimity among us. Yes, for sure. And I think I remember that time that what Daryl talked about. Actually, it was concerned Indigenous and lay people. And it was because of an issue of denial that came up in the Catholic Register. And it was terrible what they were talking about, almost taking the attitude of whatever this person is out in Edmonton who thinks residential schools were the best things in sliced bread. And so a lot of us were deeply offended by the editorial content of the Catholic Register. And so we got together. And so this amazing place in Arnprior, right along a beautiful Ottawa River, we were there, and we had pipe ceremonies, we had smudging, we had an enculturated mass in Catholic. We brought in people who read, those who could read the first reading in their Indigenous language. And we had smudging, and at the time of the celebration of the Eucharist, the consecration, we played drums, because the drum is the heartbeat of Mother Earth, but it also takes prayers up to our Creator. And when you elevate the priests who consecrate, who elevate the host and also the wine. That was the very first time as an Indigenous Catholic I ever felt, wow, this is amazing. And I think this is what our people can actually offer, like the Our Father. I knew that in my language. And why can't we recite the Our Father when in Mass, followed by either English or Francais or whatever the language or vernacular is there? But I think it's important for Indigenous people to be involved in the celebration of liturgy. For example, I'll give you an idea. Here, our bishop, and when we have celebrations on the Feast Day of Lady Guadalupe, we bring in Indigenous spiritual ways. We bring in the drum. We bring in the the sweetgrass. We have smudging. We have songs. And the Our Father is usually, I'm usually the one who's asked to recite the Our Father in my language, followed by English. But it can be done, and to me, this is one of the exciting things of enculturation that Pope John Paul II brought to the world. When we think of the time of the canonization of St. Juan Diego, it was right after World Youth Day in Toronto in 2002. Remember, I was there. But when he went on July 31st and canonized St. Juan Diego, let me just see if I can capture his words here because they were beautiful. Here's what he said. Can't find it here right now, I don't think. But anyway, in essence, he said that was the best form of enculturation because Juan Diego did not have to surrender his indigenous identity, and the Our Lady Guadalupe brought the presence and spoke the indigenous language. Just to give you an example, I've been invited to speak to residential school survivors here this coming weekend in Nova Scotia. But back in 2008, when I first went there, they didn't want to hear anything from me about Our Lady Guadalupe. But in that mass were 4 of my cousins from Tobic, and they asked me after mass. They were crying, and I said, "What happened? Is there something I said that was offensive?" He said, "We went to the residential school, and no one ever told us that the Blessed Mother spoke an Indigenous language. And to hear you tonight that from the very beginning in the 1500s, there was this moment of enculturation." And they cried. And so after that, they would invite me to, because they knew I was Catholic, but I was also Indigenous. So they came and said, "Can you share with us your love of Our Lady Guadalupe and what she means to our people?" And so I think that's the lesson that non-Indigenous people have to hear as well, because Blessed Mother is for all of us. I mean, Mother of Jesus, but Jesus is one of us. So Blessed Mother is one of us as well. And so I think that connection is crucial for Indigenous people to identify with the language of our church and the teachings. And when you talk about, I think the bishop you're talking about, Archbishop, the new Archbishop you have in Winnipeg, I know him, Murray Chatelain. He and I go back a long way, and he can actually celebrate Mass in Cree. And so here's a man who knows the language of the people and will celebrate that. But I can go all this longer, but I think to me, when we met there, I know, Daryl, you were a little bit upset, but for those of us who live that, we look at hope, we look at celebration, and I remember driving back, Father Curtis and I, we spoke a lot about that, and it was from just one sideline of this whole thing. One of the things that happened, and they said, "Okay, does anybody have ideas what we could do?" I said, "Why don't we pray the Rosary in Canada every month in the Indigenous language?" And so that has happened. We haven't started yet, probably in October again. But you see, when people pray together, they're worshiping together, and they love and respect each other. Amen.
Oh, man. Did I get all of you? I did. Does anybody have anything to add? So,
Can I just, it's just a footnote on my thing.
yes.
When I went to university, it's the first time I was allowed to open the Bible. This is 1964, because back then the priests didn't want you to read the Bible, right? The Bible was on our coffee table, it had the record of birth stats and all this. That was all it was. But when I started to study theology, I'll tell you, I'm just going to give you one important passage that has remained in my mind for a long, long time. And it's from the Acts of the Apostle. And it says, "Then Peter addressed them. 'The truth I have come to realize,' he said, 'is that God does not have favorites, but that everyone of any nationality who fears God and does what is right is acceptable to him. It is true, God sent his word to the people of Israel, but it was to them that the good news of peace was brought by Jesus Christ. But Jesus Christ is Lord of all people.'" So he's Lord of our people too, you see? So if I could get that, once I was able to read the English portion of all that, the Bible, then how about the rest of our church, you know? How about our faith formations? Anyway, that's it. Thank you.
So, I've got something to add too. So, at the parish level, Akwesasne is in 3 dioceses, Augsburg, Valleyfield, and Ottawa, Cornwall. And so in our church, in our community, we were introduced to synodality from each of the 3 dioceses. And each of the 3 dioceses had different approaches. And so when I came up with the bright idea about we need an Indigenous synod, it was because of my experience at the ground level, right? You know, because they had many, and you might be able to speak to this too. You know, they had many meetings in each of the 3 dioceses. I'm more familiar with Augsburg and Valleyfield, and so they had, you know, several sessions of, you know, to discuss synod. But my experience was that, you know, the Indigenous people that were there, our voice kind of got lost into that, you know, bigger conversations of synod, you know, at the, you know, multiple parish diocese level. And, you know, I read with great interest, and I know, Graydon, you mentioned it too, you know, kind of that national synthesis for Canada. And you know, I was very interested in the fact that, you know, some people walked to the table with skepticism, because they were kind of like, is any of this going to result in anything that's going to happen within the church? And then the other thing is, you know, is our voice going to be heard? Because someone mentioned, you know, women and youth, and, you know, persons with disabilities, and so I'm wondering what your thoughts are, because that's where, you know, that's where my idea was coming from, is because we have some good examples of where, you know, the Indigenous voice is being heard in a better way, but is it good enough? And, you know, do you think that the documents that well, and again, I think the national synthesis does a good job of at least mentioning, you know, the Indigenous voice in a couple places. But, you know, on the world level, like, I'm still curious if you think that our voice was heard. And, you know, was your experience with synodality similar to what I saw here in your communities? I'll throw that out there. That's a hard one, I guess.
I think for me, our parish up in Tobic, I mean, there was never any attention given to this at all. But I think maybe a way into, I guess, convincing the bishops of Canada, not only to be to say yes, this is a good idea, but we have to remember that on March 8th, 2002, I'm sorry, 2022, after 2023, after the Pope Francis came, the bishops wrote letters to the people of Canada, First Nations, the Métis, and the Inuit. And so that hasn't really gone too far. And yet, the intent of those letters were important. And maybe this is where, because somehow these letters, pastoral letters, were sent out, probably a majority of Catholics have never seen these letters unless you got access to a computer. They don't talk about them from the pulpit, I can tell you that. And you don't see that too much in any Catholic media as well. So I think maybe, but the invitation was there that the bishops would like to have dialogue with Indigenous people in this country and the people of God, as they say, the others. And I think this may be a possibility for us to say, okay, maybe at a national level, regional level, or whatever, let's take the bishops up on this and on our own initiate the initiatives so that every parish or and the Indigenous communities in particular would be part of that dialogue. And I love to talk in circle because everybody has to listen to you, right? There's only one who can talk, and you can't resolve anything unless everybody's been heard and said. So, and this would be something new for the hierarchy of the church. Believe me, it is. So, anyway, I was going to mention something else later on in question 4, but I think this may be the invitation that may be open for us. I'll just stop there.
But that's a good point, Graydon, that those letters, like around the time when the Pope came, they were, well circulated in the social media, and they came from and they responded to the Indigenous people, which included Inuit and Métis and First Nations, from those perspectives. And maybe that's another piece of the Indigenous synodality, is to, resurrect those letters, like, especially since we have September 30th coming up. Maybe we should print out those letters and take them to the cathedral with us. Father Darrell, did you have something you wanted to add? Am I putting you guys on the spot, by the way?
No. I just I got distracted there for a little bit, and I went off onto a tangent in my own mind. But let's see now. What was I going to say? I think we should move on.
Oh.
I don't want to ramble.
Well, let me just give you some feedback. Let me see here. So there was several comments about the land acknowledgement. Okay. So one comment was, why can't people pray the Our Father in their own language at Mass, either Ojibwe or Spanish or Tagalog or Swahili or English? They said, as Graydon said earlier, prayer is richer in his language. God's first language is silence. So I'm not sure if they misquoted you. Another thing is, in our parish, St. Gabriel, we have printed out the main prayers in Ojibwe and laminated the papers. And we also have started to sing the Mass parts in Ojibwe, as well as singing a song of blessing in the language before preaching at every Mass, and smudge with using the medicines. And in Winnipeg, at the Diocese of St. Boniface, we do not have any Indigenous people in our congregation. The majority is African and Filipino. How do we, in our parish, approach truth and reconciliation? Any suggestions to the approach we should take, and any suggestions would be greatly appreciated. Does anybody want to take a stab at that? Or should we keep going, Father? I'll read the next comment. I think an Indigenous synod is a good idea, and I remember that being mentioned at the synodal gathering in Waterloo. Would non-Indigenous people be allowed to take part to learn from our Indigenous sisters and brothers? Yes. And thanks, Graydon, for those hope-filled and inspirational comments. I agree that we pray together, we are more inclusive and less likely to exclude others. And I'm grateful too that Father Darrell shared his vulnerability about how participation in the Indigenous conversation circle was transformational, in that he realized not all people are angry. So, okay, I'm going to move on to the next one.
I think Brother Thomas had a comment.
Okay, Brother Thomas.
If I could respond briefly to Carla from St. Alphonsus and Ruth Ann. I've been at St. Alphonsus, visited there, and I looked out and I saw that the church of my godparents was now a church of Africans and Filipinos. And I was inviting people to reflect on Indigenous issues. And when I look out at that, I said, wow, what a wonderful opportunity for that parish, because it's a parish filled with Indigenous and colonized people. And Filipinos don't always remember that they were colonized, but when the Spanish came to to the Pueblo people in what's now New Mexico. When the Pueblo people resisted, they chopped off the men's feet. When they came to Philippines, when the Filipino tribal people resisted, they chopped off their feet. There's a lot in common. And it would be very interesting in these parishes to try to have some dialogue with some Indigenous people and to reflect on the similarity, what are some of the similarities, how they are not so different, even though they look different, they talk different, but there are important shared realities.
Yes, good point. Thank you. Yes. Anybody
You
else
know,
wanna?
too, in Querido, Amazonia, I don't speak Spanish, but the Pope wrote an apostolic exhortation after the Synod on the Amazon. And so much of it is about Indigenous peoples in the Amazon, but it applies everywhere. You know, it can apply up to here. We can learn from what his reflections are in this apostolic exhortation. And one of them, one of the things that he says is we have to beware as Indigenous peoples need to be aware of the new forms of colonization taking place. You know, it's not just the old forms that have become now anachronistic. There are new forms of colonization that we have to be aware of, and technological forms of all these different forms of colonization today that we need to be aware of. Anything that kind of erodes our own worldview, our cultures, our way of thinking, that can be seen also as a kind of form of colonization. And there's new forms, financial, economic, digital, all these other things too. So I just would say something like that, but I think too, I think Tom is so right. Talking about reconciliation, it's not just an Indigenous issue. Like these people in that parish, it's saying there could be rich conversations about the meaning of reconciliation too, and the church hasn't always been kind. It's been a major source of colonization around the world. And, that's something we have to admit. It's a dark chapter in the history. So how can there can be a flourishing of different reflections on the meaning of reconciliation, not just with Indigenous in Canada, although that's very important, but also with these other people, Philippine, African, and so forth. Anyway.
Thank you, Father. Someone pointed out here, like, how do I reconcile in my head Indigenous and colonizer when many of my friends are relatively new to Canada and left colonized countries? The labeling divides and leaves people out. So they said, thank you to all presenters for the gift of your time, to kind of talk about, this issue of Indigenous Synod. There's also a comment that the gathering that Father Darrell and Graydon talked about helped those who were present to meet each other and learn about each other, which is what you've been saying. And many of us already knew each other, but we're never connected. So one of the challenges is creating some way of finding out who and where the Indigenous people are, and then maybe have a national directory of some kind. So yeah, that's a good idea. Okay, I'm going to move us on to the next, unless anybody has any other comments on this one. I'll go to the next question, which is the fourth question. So in addition to applying the lessons of the Synod on synodality, what other issues do you feel are most urgent for the Church to address relative to Indigenous Catholics and truth and reconciliation? And I'll start with you, Graydon.
Oh, well, thank you very much. I mean, even just that previous discussion could have gone on and on and on, because I noticed in the chat box, some people were saying, if there's going to be an Indigenous gatherings, would non-Indigenous people be welcome? And our people have always been welcoming. We have never said, don't come here, don't come there, because we believe in acceptance. We believe in sharing our views, not dominating. This is the beauty of these circles that we have, to share ideas. Even if you disagree with somebody, you still have to have the respect of listening to a voice. And so on this particular one, of course, I'm again refocusing a little bit more on enculturation. And I'll just give you examples, I guess, first of all. You know, for those of us who remember when Pope John Paul II came here in 1984, when he went to the Martyr Shrine in Ontario, because I know Father Robert is here from there, and well, Pope John Paul II agreed to be smudged. And believe me, 1984, that was a very radical thing in the Catholic Church. And I said, wow, isn't that beautiful that the head of the Catholic Church recognizes one of our spiritual ways? And I said, what's the difference between smudging and incense? I mean, we use incense in our church. And incense doesn't come it comes from a different culture, different country, but it's been part of the Catholic Church. So I think it's important that smudging be part of our Catholic Church as well. It doesn't necessarily have to be borrowed from another country. But I think that's one thing, and the other thing is, unfortunately, Pope Francis couldn't be smudged. But the elder who was going to do it in Quebec City, because I was there at the Citadel as a former lieutenant governor, I had the privilege of being invited. I met this elder from Huron Village or Lorette, in their language, that. He said, because he had the smudge, he had the bowl and everything. I said, are you going to smudge the Pope? He says, no, I can't. I said, well, why not? The Pope only has one lung. He can't even have incense. So at least he was open to it. So he gave him a braid of sweetgrass. And braid of sweetgrass in our culture is the braid of Mother Earth. And the braid of sweetgrass is very spiritual, it's medicinal and all that. And the pictures, I think, didn't reveal how the Pope brought the sweetgrass and took deep breaths in that, And sweetgrass has a medicinal purpose because it'll clear up inside of your body. So there's health perspective as well. I'm not trying to say there should be a market in sweetgrass, but I can tell you that, it's medicinal and it's very sacred and spiritual for our people. And so when we celebrate, use incense, why can't you have somebody smudge as we go along? I'm not sure how many people here know about the Sacred Heart Church in Edmonton. It's Indigenous. And I remember visiting that church a number of years ago, and they believe me, they did a beautiful dance as the entrance song. And, a liturgical dance as they entered the church. And when it came collection time, they had a blanket, and we all had to go up and do a dance and put our money on this beautiful blanket, you see. So it's the idea of celebrating, giving something, offering something for something else. And it was in that very church when Pope Francis said, because in the background of him was the teepee. And he said the teepee that Indigenous people have has the same significance as the Jewish tradition. They had ceremonies in their tents. And this is where the sacredness of there, and I hope everybody would read that portion of the homily. Believe me, it's very enculturating of what he said, and so that anyway, that thing, and the other thing is probably because I read a lot of this historical stuff, and when Pope John Paul II went to visit the Indigenous people of Australia, and I think that's in 1986. I'll have to find a piece of paper here on that. But anyway, he said, you don't have to be like everybody else. Why don't you pray the Bible in your own language? It's not as if you have to borrow somebody's hat or somebody's shoes to be different. You're Indigenous, you're Christian, and the two, there is no conflict between either of these. Now, our people, Indigenous people, have to hear that. And they have to experience that in our parishes, in our churches, in our celebrations of liturgy. But the greater church also has to be open to that. And it's nice to say, the month of June is National Indigenous History Month or whatever it is. But I'm going to share just one final thing with you. In northern British Columbia, I'm not sure how many of you ever heard of Rose Prince. But Rose Prince was one of the ones who went to the residential school there in Fraser Lake area. And I was asked to go there by Bishop Jensen to come and share. And I could not believe how many people were coming from Washington State, British Columbia, Yukon, Northwest Territories, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and Winnipeg to celebrate. And my hope is someday this Rose Prince is going to be a saint, and she should be a saint. And why do I say that? When she died, and she loved the residential school, she went there. When she died, they buried her, and inside of that coffin, they put roses. Much later, they had to replace the graves to another site. When they came to her coffin, the coffin opened, there had been no decay on her at all. And the roses was smelling just as fresh. Now there is a process in the Catholic Church. If somebody who's died and the body stays the same, that's supposed to be a shortcut to sainthood. But I think she deserves, and I think Father Rob will recognize. There's a Joseph Chiwatnawa was a Huron, a Wendat, and he helped the Jesuits in that area of the shrine where the shrine is located. But he became a Catholic. And in that prayer, if anybody ever wants to read that prayer, I'll send it to you. After he did some silent prayer, he said, Jesus, you are my chief. There is no other. So that is the strongest affirmation then of an Indigenous voice back in the, I don't know, 1640 something or 16, whatever the date was. An Indigenous person recognized Jesus as his chief and that he is one of them. So that's why I'm so strong on these things, that the more we share of these stories, we're not inventing the wheel. We're going back and saying, okay, let's redo evangelization. Let's redo colonization. Let's do involving our brothers and sisters of the Indigenous communities and learn so that we can be all brothers and sisters and Jesus is our brother. That's it. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Graydon. Thomas.
I've got a full page of things I could share, but I'm going to concentrate on one that I think is really super important. Last week at our celebrations, our ceremonies, one of the elders, in thanking the survivors, said, "We're so grateful to you because you prepared the way." This, I've been meditating on that ever since, what that means for Indigenous people that are younger than the survivors of residential school, and what that means for those of us who are not Indigenous, how their suffering and their courage and persistence in saying, you have to listen to us and what we experience, the truth of what we experience, how that paved the way for a whole different relationship in our country. We're not the same. One of the ways we need to pave the sorry, I'll go back a little bit. They pave the way also to look at many other truths besides the residential schools where there has been injustice, where there has been colonization. So this needs to be given its time, but we need to look at other matters. Daryl mentioned the Synod of Amazonia, where one of the main issues that kept coming out, we're not able to have local leadership because of the question of celibacy. And the Pope and his advisors could not hear that. They could not respond. It's true in Amazonia. It's true in Indian country in Canada that we have 7 Indigenous priests and some of them are elderly and sick. We desperately need Indigenous leadership. As I said, a non-Indigenous person can never understand what Indigenous people live, their culture, their thinking, their experience. And so whatever we have to do, if we have to set aside celibacy or if we have to set aside the rule of only male priesthood, we must find leadership. And in the meantime, I think our priority as a church needs to be that we need to look for the natural leaders, some of them who may not be in church every Sunday, and the ones that are carrying their rosaries, but they're natural leaders. We need to find them and give them what they need, understanding of theology, Christian theology and scripture, etc., to be leaders in their own community. Until we do this, whatever apologies we make about the residential schools, we are still a colonizing church.
So true, Brother Thomas.
Hmm. I
Father
would say
Gerald?
too, a colonizing church would say that indigenous spiritual traditions are inferior to the spiritual traditions in the church that come from Europe. Germanic traditions, French Gallic traditions, English, Celtic traditions are all revered and have become accepted. And yet smudging that Graydon was talking about, there are a lot of bishops in Canada who are opposed to smudging during the liturgy. If you want to do it off from somewhere else, okay, or you can do it outside the liturgy. And I hear this often. Bishops are suspicious of the smudging ritual, the ritual of purification, and other priests too. I was asked to go to a mass here in the archdiocese, and the priest said, well, do you have to do that smoke thing? Do you have to do that? Because we have people here who would protest it if you did it. So I said, well, I'm not going to go then. And then the diocese contacted me. They said, oh, please, can you just go there, but not do the smudging? And so I wound up and said, yes, okay. So I went. Nevertheless, I felt that, okay, so this is my main point. It says here, what other issues do you feel are most urgent for the church? And one of them is education. And we've been talking about this. That's all of us have been talking about that in some form, because Graydon mentioned the denialism that appeared in the Catholic Register. It's one of the only papers, nationwide papers that we have. It comes from Toronto, and the editor was producing within that issue articles that were in a way denying the pain of survivors of residential schools, saying, oh, it wasn't that bad. Was it really that? No, it wasn't that bad. And they would have books and say, well, see here, there's some survivors who say it was a great time. They come, this kind of thing. And my fear, I don't know if I need to be afraid, but I get really disturbed when I hear things that are denying the pain that Native people went through in the residential school system. I have a mother and my uncle and my aunt. They survived residential school systems, but I never heard about their days in They never talked about it. They never told us, what they went through. And who wants to sit around and talk about their traumas? You don't do that around a kitchen table or around a campfire. Say, oh, let me tell you about this time when this happened to me and it was traumatizing. The first time I began to hear stories from my own family about residential schools was when they had to create narratives in order to receive compensation. They had to, and my uncle said, can you help me with that? I don't know how to do that. And so I said, yeah. And I just couldn't believe the story, the things that went on. And I called my brother and I said, listen, did you ever know this? My brother said, yes, we heard those stories, Daryl, when he had been drinking. Those stories came out when he was, drinking, and then they would surface, and then he'd begin crying, and we thought they were exaggerated. We didn't believe that these really could be possible. So it wasn't all physical pain. There was a lot of degradation, name calling, fear. My aunt talks about her fear, of being in the school. So there was lots of trauma in these schools. It wasn't all just about being slapped and kicked and whatever, or put into, some sort of isolation, or being forced to eat food that they couldn't stand and things like that. There were other things, psychological abuse. emotional abuse. There are all kinds of things that these, and you know, too bad trauma is not easily healed without help. And a lot of these people still live today with trauma, and they've passed it on to their children, you know, and to their and subsequently grandchildren. So the education that is needed is to let people know really what these, I mean, we've done a lot. I don't want to say like that's what the whole TRC was about, you know, people telling their stories and listening to it. And I remember hearing Murray Sinclair's wife. She was sharing one night at Carleton University. There was a gathering, and she said after each of these national events, Murray Sullivan would come home and he'd go into the basement, turn all the lights off and have the TV on, and just sat in front of the TV for hours. Silence. It was a way for him to kind of, I don't know, process all the stories he heard. Just, he couldn't, it was too overwhelming to hear about these stories. And this is not, it's not just in Canada, you know, Bishop Tutu in South Africa said the same thing. These stories I heard were traumatizing to me. I had to find a way to deal with all of these narratives and these stories of what went wrong. And as long as people deny and have no knowledge or less sympathy or don't know what took place in the schools, then there's going to be a hard time for us to find a point to a point of reconciliation. You know, as long as these, and they're deniers across Canada, writing books about it. This, you know, there's a scholar from Alberta who does this. He writes books about, you know, it wasn't all that bad, and making fun, you know, of this whole residential school history. So I think education is key, and not only among the I can say non-Indigenous, I guess I can say, but also within the Indigenous communities too. We need also to have more, you know, I didn't get to grow up in a Native community. So I had to learn a lot of things. Now, my mother was Indigenous, and I learned from her. You know, her culture was, that's well all I knew. It's my first culture, you know, but we didn't do any of these traditional things, practices when I was growing up. I had to learn again, and that came to me like fish in water. And but you know, a lot of Native people also need education in about how to be forgiving, maybe any way to help us all experience some measure of reconciliation. It's now I'm going to end with this. There is a book called, it's recent, it's called Ally is a Verb, and it's written for settlers and non-Native people. To what is it to be an ally? And it's written by Rose LeMay. She's an Indigenous woman from British Columbia. And I went to listen to her talk about her book at the National Archives. There was a writers' festival. And she mentioned this story. She said, you know, many people, many Indigenous people, Murray Sinclair was one, and others who say, it took us 7 generations to get to where we are today. It was 7 years of this kind of, you know, existence, to the point where we see the fragilities of Indigenous people across Canada. You know, we're the most vulnerable peoples in Canada, is the Indigenous peoples. And he said, it's going to take 7 generations to overcome all of that. And Rose LeMay responds to these kinds of ideas. Murray's not the only one, that it would take 7 generations to overcome. She said, we don't have 7 generations. We can't wait 7 generations. In Nunavut has the highest rate of suicides among youth in the world, in the whole world. There is no place that has higher rates of suicide among the youth than in Nunavut. We can't wait for 7 generations for the healing that is required. We've got to do it now. The healing has to begin now. We don't have the time. So there's an urgency. She expresses urgency, you know, in these matters. And you know, I'm learning about all of these things. You know, I'm privileged. My bishop has given me the gift of a sabbatical for a year to study reconciliation, in which I get to go all over. I'm going to be imbued, you know, going over. I leave tomorrow for Thunder Bay you know, and I don't know if you've read the story Seven Fallen Feathers about the youth there. And this is a big deal, Native youth and, you know, dying and the racism in Thunder Bay and all this kind of stuff, you know. So I'm going to go and listen. I'm going to listen. What is their experience? What, you know, and how are they overcoming it? And I'm not just listening to Catholics. I'm meeting with United Church, people from the United Church. They're anxious to be a part of this. And the Anglican Church, and there's a group called Living Hope Ministries. They are Mennonites. And I wrote them and I said, I'd like to meet with you to discuss, you know, they were the first ones to respond. Yes, let's do it. So I'm just at the beginning of this learning, this journey of learning about reconciliation across the country. Because, you know, as I mentioned, I'll end here. I'm talking way too long. My first insight on the diversity of thinking about reconciliation came from that retreat we had in Arnprior, at the Galilee Center, when I was with all these other Indigenous people. And I realized, wow, I thought we were all one lump. I thought we all were angry. I thought we all were mad. And I learned, no, it's just you. Or it's just you and someone else. And it's not, most people aren't that thing. So I'm so looking forward to seeing what more I can learn as I make this journey of my sabbatical here and visiting. I plan to visit all 10 provinces and 3 territories. And so that's what I'm looking forward to. Anyway, I talked so long. I'm sorry. Thank you. Miigwech.
Do I have anything from the other 2 panelists? Because we are getting to the time when we open up to our audience for any quick questions or comments that they want to share with us. So I want to thank you as our distinguished panel for your thoughtful conversation, and especially about the important components of synodality within an Indigenous context. Graydon.
Well, I'm just going to read you something here because I study what popes say when they encounter Indigenous peoples, not just ones in Pope Francis in Bolivia, but when Pope Francis went to Lac Saint Anne in Alberta. Here were his words, and this is words for all of us. Anytime I speak to a non-Indigenous people, I say, here is what could help. Here's what he said. When looking at the Indigenous peoples and thinking of their history and the pain that they endured, what do I do for Indigenous peoples? Do I merely listen with curiosity, purified by what happened in the past, or do I do something concrete for them? Do I pray, meet, read, support them, and let myself be touched by their stories? So there we go. We've got the Francis solution of this problem that we can be used as in the synodality which I'll have. But I think those words of wisdom that he spoke at that moment are going to be forgotten unless we say, here was one of the graceful times that come. So I'll just stop there, my friends, I guess.
Thank you. We need to share that. I'll have to talk to Kathy if we're going to do like a little summary of this webinar, because there's so many wonderful things that have come from all of you. Again, I'm opening it up to the audience if there's any questions or comments. Again, I want to thank you for your wisdom and some wonderful perspectives. And I do see that there's a raised hand, so I don't know if the person could type their question into the chat.
It's Patricia Coder speaking, and
Okay.
and I'm from a little town outside of Ottawa, and I hope, Father Daryl, when you have time, to come out to Almont. And I just want to share with you quickly what we did in our town of 10,000 people around reconciliation. We met with an elder and a settler, and together they put, I'm sure you've all heard of the 7 gifts. Together we put the 7 gifts, grandfather teachings in our Riverside Park. We invited all peoples in our town to participate. Everybody did, but the Roman Catholic Church. I invited the bishop to come, and he never even answered. I got a letter from Pope Francis. I wrote Pope Francis a note after I saw him at Lac St. Anne, and I wept with him as he spoke to us the words that you read to us, Thomas. And he sent me a letter. Thank you, Patricia and John. My husband was the treasurer, and I told him what we were doing in its town. And His Holiness Pope Francis has received your letter and asked to reply. You know, of course, the what's his name, Nuncio writes, and he is remembering our intentions for our Indigenous and settlers that are working together on this project, and it's called The Gifts of Our Grandfather's Teachings. And I invite all of you, whenever you come to Ottawa, to take a side trip to Almont. It's just down from Arnpire, the Galilee Center, and these were the townspeople. We couldn't tell the story. We weren't even allowed to announce it in the Roman Catholic Church, let alone talk about synodality. But fortunately, Anglican Church supported a lot of the things that we were doing, because we had to have it done properly with the finances. But we became friends with all these wonderful Indigenous people, and now we have our we celebrate things in the things that we do in June. And next week on Tuesday, well, actually for 4 days, we're having a cultural at our textile museum, and on Tuesday night, can't remember the dates, but anyway, the teenagers want to do it. The teenagers are working together to hold this wonderful ceremony of reconciliation with our grandfather's teachings. So there's a way to do it, but in terms of synodality, I've never heard the word synod mentioned once in my parish. Fortunately, I am an associate of the Sisters of St. Joseph, and was able to join in with all the things going on across Canada. So I just wanted to tell you, all is not lost. All the things that you said can be done. It takes a lot. We did it for 4 years, and you can only do it once that way for myself and my husband, but there's lots of others carrying on after us. And so the second thing we did was then got the names from the RCMP of the missing and lost women, and we got a whole bunch of old books, and we covered them so we could put books in a bookcase. I think some of you have heard about the Canadian bookcases. And we put all the names on it, and I carry my woman's name in my heart and in my pocket and bring her to the stones. And so there are little things, lots of little things. And it would have been wonderful. I was more than embarrassed that, that the bishop didn't come, but the Anglican bishop came, and then the elders, lots of elders from different communities, and members from all different churches. So good luck with everybody across Canada.
As the final
Thank you.
document from the Synod said, what comes from the Spirit won't be stopped. So there's always a way the Holy Spirit will get through. I see a couple more hands up, Rosalma. You maybe want to invite those folks.
I think, Deacon Arnell wants to show us something. He keeps showing something in his screen. And could he explain what he wants to share with us? That's
Okay.
I just received this from the Diocese of Baie-Comeau. It is Notre Dame des Inuits, Our Ladies of Inuit. I am an Innu from Essipit, and I will be bringing this to the Mass on the 30th at the Cathedral in Ottawa. And I have more copies. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Okay, I'll take a couple questions.
Thank you, and hi, Father Daryl, and safe travels to you. Will be in my prayers. A while ago, I was a member of a WhatsApp group chat, and periodically Indigenous issues would come up, and somebody brought up that a white buffalo had been born, and for Indigenous peoples, that is an omen. And then the moderator of that chat had said that, there's kind of dismissed it and said, there have been 3 white buffaloes born lately. And this was a non-Indigenous person dismissing it. And I had brought it to my spiritual director, and he dismissed me. It was like, oh, that's not our faith. But as a non-Indigenous person looking at it indigenously, was it wrong of me to think that this could be an omen? And I thought, okay, 3 white buffaloes, couldn't that possibly be Trinitarian, like Father, Son, Holy Spirit? And like as a non-Indigenous person, is it wrong for me to interpret these Indigenous symbols that way, coming from a non-Indigenous background and reading my own Catholicism into it? Because I don't want to be insensitive to something that's sacred to Indigenous people. And like, what is the white buffalo? Is that symbolic? Is that meaningful to Indigenous Catholics?
Respond very briefly. That's from the plains, the prairies. That's Lakota, Nakota, Dakota. This is their culture, their perspective. That's, it's regional. It's a local thing. I know that they have, the buffalo was big, an important part of the culture of the Indigenous peoples, like in Manitoba, North Dakota, in the prairies, in the plains area. So that's significant to them. But for us in the East, we have less awareness of what it really means. But it doesn't mean that we should dismiss it, or that we shouldn't, take something, that there's a spiritual value to it. And there was a document in the Second Vatican Council called Nostra Aetate, in our times. That's what it was called. And it's about the church's realization and recognizing that we can allow ourselves to revere as holy things that come from other spiritual visions, from other faiths. And it talks a lot about the Jewish people and other groups, Hindu. We should be treading lightly on traditions which are spiritual and that have been here long before Christian faith, like Hinduism and some of the Judaism, that these are to be respected. We're not to dismiss them as if we were the only ones to receive God's revelation. So that's one thing. And it's that kind of similar thing with the white buffalo. I've heard of it, but it's not significant to me because it's not where I'm from. It's not a part of but for those people that come from Western Canada and Western United States, it's very significant. It's a good sign. It's something that's very positive going to develop. More than that, I don't know.
Braden, you have your hand up?
Yeah, I was just going to, thing is, it's a sign for the Lakota people. It's a very spiritual sign, a rebirth of what the gift. See, everything is a gift from our Creator. And the eagle is a gift from our Creator. The white buffalo is a gift from our Creator. And the spiritual symbolism of the white buffalo, it was the white buffalo in the teachings of the Lakota who brought the pipe to the people so that they could learn how to pray in a different way. And it's too bad you were dismissed for your curiosity, but believe me, it's very real for the Indigenous people in Lakota Nation, and as well as what Daryl said. In Saskatchewan, Winnipeg, and part of not Winnipeg, Manitoba, and also part of Alberta. This is why the settlers killed the buffalo, because it starved the people into submission. So when you kill a food line, that Regina is what known as skulls or something like that. But in the Lakota people, I can tell you, it's very strong spiritual meaning.
I think too, us coming from the Western world, we've lost a connection to the land and to animals and the spiritual power that comes from, those things. And as Tom mentioned tonight, when he first talked about Jean-Guy Goulet, an anthropologist who was talking with Dene, and there they were talking to the animals. Now, how many people thinks that's, very strange that these native men were talking to the animals as if they could be understood, and they believed they were understood. And I know Ojibwe people who talk to bears from Manitoulin Island. They were, speaking and they said, well, we had to speak in Ojibwe. They don't understand English. We had to speak to them in Ojibwe. So, and telling them, that kind of stuff. So the connection to land, to animals, this is a very spiritual thing. And I think we're becoming more aware of it in the Western world, of the importance and place of creation. and the things of those creatures are becoming very important, and the connection that we have to them, and not to deny the spiritual visions that come from that kind of thing.
There was just one comment that I just wanted to point out, because I'm not sure that you saw it, but Chris Butterill said that this coming Sunday, Archbishop Murray Chatelain will be inducted as Chancellor of St. Paul's College in Winnipeg, and there's a smudging ceremony as part of his induction.
Thank you. Okay, so we're at 8:28, and if anybody knows me, I'm like on the dot, on the, and I see Kathy's face. She's not, I don't know if she's happy or, but anyways, thank you for the questions that we got. Thank you for the comments. Thank you to the panelists. Oh my goodness, we could go for hours, really. And so this was just the tip of the iceberg. And I think, Kathy, we do want to consider, doing something like this again, or maybe someday there'll be a national gathering. Maybe, who knows what could come out of this. So this was a start, and I'm seeing lots of hearts going up the screen. So,
Yep.
So I guess I'm gonna 2 minutes. I want to just hear from each one of you, Graydon, Daryl, Thomas, and Kathy too, and then Bernice. Just 2 minutes. What's the takeaway from this? What do you think our next step should be? So Graydon. Next steps.
This was a Pope Francis moment, that quote I gave, and I think this is a start of something wonderful.
Okay. Father Daryl.
I just would say that I was so encouraged to hear about, people discussing enculturation, Pope Francis and his vision for the church, which includes Indigenous methods of listening and that kind of thing. So I just think it's I was encouraged by listening to Graydon and Tom, and the questions that came up were really great. So thank you. Miigwech.
Thank you, Father. Brother Thomas.
I would like to go back, if I may, to Bernice's beautiful prayer at the beginning, and to a next step, I think, for all of us, something not to be overlooked, is that as church, we tend to look internally to liturgy and catechesis and sacraments. But our church, the church, the community of God includes much wider. It is Mother Earth, and it's the creatures that Mother Earth gives sustenance to. We're all intimately connected with all of that. And thank you for bringing that up to us, Bernice, or reminding us of that at the beginning. That's part of who we are as Christians and Catholics, and sometimes we forget that vocation.
Thank you, Brother Thomas. Kathy.
I just would like to say that it's a priority at Concerned Lay Catholics that we bring Indigenous voices, or that we create space for Indigenous voices to engage with each other and with the rest, with other Catholics who are concerned about truth and reconciliation. And I want to thank all of you for being part of this conversation. And I think the next steps are what you decide they need to be, and we're here to support you in whatever that is.
Bernice.
Well, just a few notes. As Native Catholics, we are encouraged by the recognition of our Native culture, traditions, and languages in the Roman Catholic Church. The beginnings of liturgical enculturation are nourishing our spiritual lives. So this was very good, and I'm so proud of you, Dolly, for doing such a good job moderating. And thank you for inviting me to come on.
Thank you.
Learned a lot.
Yeah, we all did. So I'm going to have a few just formal kind of remarks. So as I mentioned earlier, the recording of today's presentation will be available on the CLC website in a few weeks. So if you're a subscriber, you'll receive the recording link in the next newsletter. Please sign up if you haven't done so before. And then thank you everyone that was online and for supporting us with your presence, your prayers and talents. You are the reason we did this. And so as we leave here tonight, we hope that you are enriched in your understanding of what it means to be church, confirmed in your faith, and inspired to do whatever is given to you to do, to build up the body of Christ in our place and time. And our prayer continues to be for lay Catholics everywhere to come together, to learn together, to pray together, and to act together for healing, reconciliation, and transformation. So again, thank you to our presenters. It was a wonderful conversation tonight. And for everyone that was coming, God bless you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your week. So now we'll go to Bernice for our closing prayer.
O great Spirit Creator, as we come to the end of our time together, we thank you for what has been accomplished here today. May the matters discussed serve as a catalyst to move us forward and cause us to advance and see growth in all areas of our lives and others. May we leave here recognizing you are the creator of all wisdom and you are willing to lead us forward. Therefore, let us be of one mind and be thankful for this day. Amen.
Amen. So good night, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your evening. I'm going to ask the panelists to stay online for a few minutes, so we'll just wave at you goodbye. And
thank you all.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you.